the Sensibly Speaking podcast. This is Chris Shelton, the critical thinker at large, coming at you on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, and with video here on YouTube. Okay, this week we're going to do something kind of cool, and I'm actually a little excited about it. Boy, there's so many points to make here, but we're going to talk about Scientology. We're going to talk about something called the ideal org strategy, which is basically Scientology's effort to buy new buildings for all of the churches of Scientology around the world and renovate them both at great expense, and thereby show that Scientology is expanding and prosperous and successful. A lot of people have spent a lot of time, both Scientologists, former Scientologists, and people who have never been involved in Scientology, discussing what could be the various motivations behind why this would be being done. It's a massive effort. It's international in scope. A lot of money has been invested by the Church of Scientology in this project. It's been going on since the early 2000s. And recently, just within the last 2 weeks, on the John P. Capitalist, who I've featured on this podcast before, put up an article called Scientology Ideal Orgs as Destroyers of Wealth. And this is a multi-part series. Part one has been up on his blog, which is now renamed Reasoned Life. And this really shows how former Scientologists and people who have never been involved in Scientology can truly complement one another when it comes to analyzing and looking at what's going on in the world of Scientology. And that's one of the reasons why I've so enjoyed having John P. and also Jeff Wassel on my podcast, because they've been able to give me perspectives and information that I never, as a former Scientologist and Sea Org member, I never would have even thought of or considered. And so this week, I am welcoming John P. back. Hi, John. Welcome to the podcast.
Howdy, Chris. I'm glad to be here.
Awesome. So first off, why don't we just kind of talk a bit about this article? What prompted you to put this together, and what are the basic points? And then we'll kind of dive into a lot of the details of this.
I think, this is something that ever since I fell into the world of Scientology criticism and activism 7 or 8 years ago now, I've wanted to work on, or I've wanted to offer as perhaps my main area of expertise. And of course, given all of the years that I spend in investment management, I wanted to bring that perspective to analyzing how Scientology operates. So I wanted it to be focused on the money. And of course, the Ideal Org program is a fascinating piece of the puzzle, because it's certainly the biggest area of expenditures, and it's the biggest strategic initiative going on in Scientology, and it has been for almost 20 years now, if you count the flag building and now the Ideal Org program. So I want to bring the kind of economic and strategic and financial analysis skills that I've spent all those years developing on Wall Street. I want to bring it to Scientology. So if you look back on all of the comments that I've written about Scientology, a huge chunk of them deal with this. So I'm starting a series on my blog. And by the way, just to be very clear, the address is now www.reasoned.life. And so now you can have domains that have .life, just like .com and .net and all that these days. So it's kind of a cutesy little thing. And we thought it was a good name. So all you got to do is www.reasoned.life, and you'll get there.
Excellent. And I'll post links to that in the comments section on YouTube and sensiblyspeaking.com.
Great, thanks. And so basically, so I've been fascinated by the Ideal Org program because it is just so contrary to the way that any normal business would be run, that it's just been a source of, wonderment for so many years.
Now, that's an interesting thing to say, because of course, buildings, companies buy buildings, they expand, they grow, they create new district offices, reach out into new territories. How do you see what Scientology is doing as so different or wrong from what other businesses do in that sense?
Well, the thing that that most businesses do with real estate. And I want to be very clear that I am not going to talk about companies that are in the real estate business. So I'm not going to talk about shopping mall developers or apartment companies or anything like that. I'm talking about other companies whose principal product is not real estate. Okay,
Yep.
so any rational business outside of the real estate industry is going to be about using real estate to generate the maximum amount of returns that it can. So you want to have the cheapest amount you want to pay the cheapest for the building that's going to support your mission most effectively. So if you're going to build a car plant, you want to get it out away from downtown Cleveland. You want to put it way out 60 miles out of town in a small town where land is cheap, you get a lot of tax breaks, and it's easy to expand so that you keep the investment as low as possible, because it's only a small part of what it costs to bring cars to market, then make them and sell them. And so in fact, there's a truism in Silicon Valley, and I've named it the edifice complex, that when real estate is very expensive. Bare land is incredibly expensive in Silicon Valley, and it has been for 20 or 30 years. But when companies do really, really well, they start casting about for a big headquarters complex, and they'll go shell out $200 or $300 million for some piece of 30 or 40 acres of blank land somewhere, or they'll buy something and they'll buy an old shopping mall and tear it down. But they'll throw out an enormous chunk of money and build this wonderful, amazing corporate headquarters. And if you look at what Google and Facebook are doing, they're trying to be these amazing, cutting-edge, architectural, never been done before sorts of things. So, but the thing is that for most companies, the moment that they start thinking about a fabulous headquarters building, they start taking their attention off their core business, off of the aggressiveness that drove them to growth, that got them to where they are, and their stock price usually tanks. And there have actually been studies that people like me have done over the years that correlate this, that says that, somebody announces a headquarters, and then 12 months later, the stock is worth half what it was because growth has slowed and profits have gone down. So there's a healthy skepticism on my part anyway coming in. But when you look at this, when you look at Scientology, who's not accountable to shareholders, of course, you find that their edifice complex is not only a huge distraction, but it's actually so badly done that it is probably the most clownish example of a real estate program gone amok of anything I've ever seen. And so the first thing I did is I wrote a story about the strategy level, and that's the article that we're talking about today. In the next week or two, I'll take the next step, and I'll talk about the numbers behind this. They do literally everything wrong that a commercial real estate operator would do in order to maximize their profits and the return on investment. But we'll get that in a separate post. What I wanted to do is think about, and we'll talk about, and you've been involved in some of the early aspects of this strategy. We'll talk about what started the Ideal Org. We'll talk about where it's been successful. We'll talk about where it is today, and we'll talk about where it might go in the future and why it's never going to succeed. Every one that they open is going to be worse than the ones in the past.
Right. Good. Well, there are a number of things racing through my head right now to discuss on this, but I think we'll focus first on the beginnings of this strategy, because it just so happens, and I have not really had a lot of opportunities to discuss this. I think maybe once or twice. My own personal involvement with the Ideal Org strategy, so to speak, actually goes back to before it was even called the Ideal Org strategy. It was based on Buffalo, New York. You lay out in the article, and Mike Rinder has done a wonderful job of laying out even earlier, which you based your research on, the evolution of this, how it started, and it started with Buffalo, New York. At least that's how it's got on my plate. I was a manager person for the West U.S. at the continental level of Scientology management, and I got called up to the international management headquarters, the upper middle management. I didn't go to the gold base where they, out in San Jacinto where they have the barbed wire on the fences and stuff. I just went down the street to the Hollywood Guarantee building, big 12-story edifice down there. And was taken into a room and was shown this very super confidential 2-page issue, which was basically really, it wasn't even a formal issue. It was really just a printout with some bullet points on it. And those bullet points laid out what was called a Buffalo pattern. These things were done in Buffalo, and we were looking at exporting this planning or this idea to all of the orgs. That's how it was presented to me. And the first thing that was going to be done is we were going to be sending Sea Org missions to these various orgs, starting in the Bay Area with the Stevens Creek San Jose org, which is where I was going to go to do surveys and talk to the public, the OT public, the high level public, about recruitment for joining. What is it that prevents them from joining staff? What is it that they would like to see in the orgs? What is it that they would like that would get them more motivated and excited to become part of the activity? In other words, and this was all under bullet point number 1, which was rally the field, get the OTs involved in the survival and livelihood of their own local organizations, because the phenomena that was being looked at there was that these people would go up to the top of the bridge, meaning they would have to go to Flag in Clearwater, and once they did that, they kind of disavowed their local orgs. They really didn't do much with them and weren't really very involved in them. And Miscavige was like, yeah, no, these guys need to be taking responsibility for their local field. So this will be just one more way of, this will be a new way of getting them to do that.
Yeah, and actually, it's interesting because that's a pretty decent strategic move. That's
right?
not bad strategic thinking, right?
That's
Get
right.
your customers to have intangible skin in the game simply beyond coming back and spending money with you, right?
That's right.
And so that's how, casinos go with high roller stuff, personalized attention, so you get the same butler every time that you come in to gamble, so that it feels like something more than a business where you transact giving away your money in return for, entertainment. And so, we see this in many other businesses. For example, in the software industry, you put your biggest customers on customer advisory boards. You take them away to fancy places for golf weekends where they tell you what they like and don't like about the products and what problems they're worried about solving. And so they get to hobnob with the head of Oracle or the head of Microsoft or the head of Google or whatever. You hobnob with top management, and you feel like, so it's a huge perk. They give you skin in the game beyond, hey, I've already got a ton of this, I got to keep buying it. And so not a bad strategic move.
That's exactly what Miscavige was doing.
Not a bad strategic move, but of course it's all in the implementation.
Well, exactly. And there is that little vicious undercurrent in Scientology that always exists of, you will do what we say or else. That sort of authoritarian bent that always is kind of behind the scenes a little bit, And with these OTs, the sort of blackmail point with them was, if you don't pony up, if you don't start showing some initiative and some drive to get your local organization going, we can always deny you your next OT level. We can always, make you have to spend more money and spend more time proving to us that you are a good, loyal Scientologist, and then we will hand out the next secret information that you need in order to move up the bridge to total freedom. So that was those were some of the factors that were played against each other.
Yeah, I can just see that as something like Drew Carey on The Price is Right saying, and behind door number 2, is that the new Jaguar, or is it a free trip to ethics with 6 intensives of sec checks?
You got it. That's exactly right. That is exactly how it was done. And Miscavige also was trying to solve another problem, which is that the staff were barely keeping the doors open. I mean, that was pretty much what was going on with most of, and is still going on with these orgs. So they didn't, so if they were going to dump this whole new idea on the staff of, now you guys are not only going to keep the doors open, I mean, they would run into the problem you just mentioned. While they weren't publicly traded companies, these churches are still staffed by most of the time, a handful of staff. And these are not people who are capable of going out and fundraising millions of dollars to go buy a new building. Otherwise, they wouldn't have rent problems and lease problems and having to be bailed out, as I've gone over in past episodes about how they weren't even making the rent and management had to come in and subsidize them. So this was the crew of resources Miscavige had in his hand to deal with. So he goes, well, these guys clearly aren't going to get the job done. So I'm going to have to rally the field and get these guys excited about this in order to get this fundraising idea kicked off and really going in earnest.
Yeah, and so he's got so I think it's a good strategy, but then let's look at the implementation.
Then the other points, let me just go over a couple other points on this to lay out how this went down. Was the idea is to not only rally the field and get them going, but also to beef up the number of staff, get more auditors in there, get more supervisors, revitalize them, get them all excited about delivering the product of Scientology. And then also one other very important key point of this strategy was to replace the top level executives of all of these Scientology churches with OTs. The idea being that the OTs were the powerhouses who were going to bring it, but really in the real world, because Miscavige doesn't believe in OT superpowers, he knows that's not, he knows that's bullshit. But what those OTs do represent is a symbology of successful Scientologists, superpowers and all of that. And so if he installs an OT or a board of OTs at the top of each one of these churches, then the idea is they can't help but succeed. And these OTs who make it to the top of the bridge tend to be the successful business people and richer, more affluent Scientologists. So they'll bring, their business acumen or whatever skill set they have to the churches, which these staff members who've been, hobbling about for 20 years, really only running the show according to the crappy directions they're receiving from management, from internalized Scientology management, and they're not getting anywhere. So I think Miscavige was really hoping to inject a whole new, electric, really blow these things wide open with this strategy.
Well, in fact, what it sounds like he's essentially doing with the OT committees, kind of having some dotted line input into how their local org is run, is this is the standard Hubbard approach of when something doesn't work, add another separate layer of management that comes in, right? So you had the Commodore staff, then you had the CMO, then you had the CLOs, then you had whatever the hell else, 9 different levels of people that could pop up at any time and tell you how to do your job and often be in conflict with each other. So now you've added another one called the OT committees, but I think that all of this is fundamentally premised on the notion that the staff is forever going to be nitwits that can't manage their way out of a paper bag. And to that point, Rinder raises another point as a justification for the ideal org strategy and for having to have real estate be there is automating the recruiting process, right? And this is a huge strategic mistake. If I understand what I read in Margaret Singer's Cults in Our Midst or Robert J. Lifton's work or any of those sort of canonical reference works on how cults operate, he's automating recruitment because the staff is such a bunch of nitwits that they can't be trusted to talk coherently about what Scientology can do for somebody. So they take somebody in, they plop them in front of a screen, they stay as long as they do, they wander out, nobody talks to them and says, so what'd you think? And nobody even follows up. And That's so, right. This automated recruiting, which needed all sorts of expanded video facilities, was another pretext for having to completely redo all the orgs, which, may have had the square footage, but certainly didn't have the cool looking layout. In fact, one of the things we might want to do is to circle back later and talk about what is the commitment to dissemination that the ideal orgs embody, and how do we know? We'll circle back and we'll talk about that a little bit later.
Yeah, we can. That's a whole podcast in itself, because I can tell you that.
So let's.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so let's continue looking at the first three orgs in some detail and how it spawned the strategy, right? Buffalo, Johannesburg, and Tampa. Let's try and stitch that together, and then we can go on and look at the strategy.
Yeah, absolutely. Just an underlying thing I just want to comment on while it's still fresh on my mind is one of the things that impedes this whole ideal org strategy, and what you just laid out there about sicking somebody in front of a TV screen is just one way that this has shown itself or manifested, is that David Miscavige personally hates people and he doesn't trust them. And so all of his strategies are sort of hinged on getting rid of people, getting people out of the picture, when Scientology's entire model is based on people interacting with one another.
Well, yeah,
So,
I mean that's how you recruit. Cult recruiting in the
yes,
past, although this is changing with YouTube and social media based recruiting efforts for some of these new age type cults, um, is a very labor intensive process. I wrote a thing earlier this week or yesterday about Lyndon LaRouche versus Hubbard in a couple of areas, which is kind of a fun little romp. But I was approached by LaRouche recruiters, and these guys worked me for, two of these kids worked me through about his hydrogen fusion front group on campus one afternoon for about 2 hours until I finally realized there was something a little off, and I walked away. But they spent 4 hours of their time rolling me, and God knows how many hours standing there with nobody to talk to. So cult recruiting has always been a very personal uh, endeavor. Something like half of people are brought into cults through friends and family.
that's right. In Scientology, it's definitely even more than that.
Yeah, so automating it, of course, is a disaster.
Total,
But
total, and complete. And that's one of the reasons why I have said that David Miscavige is not really very interested in bringing in new members, because he does everything he does and orders sabotages that effort. So he's either far stupider on that subject than I think he is, because I think he's actually a fairly smart guy, or, as I think, he just doesn't care. Anyway, either way, doesn't really matter. So so good. So diving back into the history of this and how this evolved. While Flag is the biggest organization of Scientology in the world and delivers the most services and that sort of thing, what happened with Flag was kind of a microcosm of what Miscavige then ended up exporting to everywhere else. They bought this property. They literally built from nothing this tremendous edifice that now has taken over the skyline of Clearwater, Florida, and they fundraised millions and millions of dollars for it over a course of something like 20 years.
well,
And it was
the
wildly successful as far as Scientology was concerned.
yeah, and I would say you have to think of the flag building as a fundraising project that had a real estate gig as a side effect.
Yes, yes, I think that's exactly right. The idea was that they were going to initially, at least this is how it was marketed to Scientologists. I can't speak to what David Miscavige was really doing behind the scenes, if there was anything else going on here. But what I can say is that following the IRS tax exemption in 1993, that was, I believe, when first talk started about purchasing this plot of land next to the Fort Harrison Hotel and building a property that would house this new series of steps or auditing actions that would be done called superpower. And that was when the first whisperings of this started. And I think it was, if we're going to relate this back to the IRS and spending money, it seems almost date coincident that the talk about buying this property and building this edifice and investing money in that came right on the heels of Scientology getting their tax exemption.
That, and there's also a story, and I don't have a way to judge this. This is something that the exes who were, on scene at the time might have more perspective on. But there's also a story that this was in some way a reaction to the Lisa McPherson disaster, right? That Scientology needed to distract memberships from that, and potentially, I'm not sure I'm getting the dates wrong, but the Wallersheim case, the Julie Christopherson case, some other legal, devastating legal blows. And so that there needed to be a positive focus to handle to get people excited about being Scientologists again. And if you think strategically, they had the Fort Harrison Hotel. They had a bunch of crappy buildings where you could go and get auditing and, et cetera. So they had all these crappy facilities, but it wasn't a destination resort. And you have the world's biggest destination resort about an hour down the road in the form of Disney World. And so you could learn from the concept that you had a hotel that was a nice place that people could go and they could stay and get audited in the ballrooms of the hotel, but it wasn't really a destination resort. And it was really just, it was just, this is a place where you go to get these services. But by adding this
and it was
flag
the only
building,
place you could go for those services.
right, but it was still an artificial need to go to flag. But
Right.
now if you have this really cool building and it has, what are all those stupid statues? Is that the tone scale or is that the different dynamics?
The dynamics. They
right, so
actually
they have,
all of it. They're supposed to represent all the various basic fundamental concepts of Scientology,
right,
but
so you have all this horrible,
they also renovated all the properties in Clearwater. I'm
yeah,
sitting here like kind of connecting all these dots now, and I'm like, wait a minute. They did a massive investure of millions of dollars into all of the Clearwater properties. The Advanced organization got a whole overhaul. They added 2 floors to it. The Fort Harrison got a full refurbish.
yeah.
Like every building, even the Sea Org berthing buildings, which were old hotels that had been purchased down the road from the Fort Harrison, even they got a full refurbish.
Yeah. And what's interesting, by the way, is I saw a number at one point that said they spent like, I think it was either $145,000 or $175,000 a room on the Fort Harrison for renovation. And I looked it up at the time, and the standard cost to build a new hotel room of decent quality, we're not talking like crappy motel, we're talking, Marriott type construction costs are like $110,000 a room. And so they were paying an exorbitant amount on the renovation of the Fort Harrison. But when you're
But
taking
it all served the end of, yes, Mr. IRS inspector, we are complying 100% with reinvesting the money that we're making into our church facilities to, deal with all this expansion we're experiencing.
Yeah, so basically, when you look at it, as near as we can figure, people have gone through before me. I haven't done it personally, but people have gone through and added up all the statuses given, and the minimum status level, the minimum dollars it takes to hit each of those status levels, and they believe that the Scientology raised over $200 million for this building, which, as near as I can figure, didn't cost more than $1.25. And so the fundraising total is likely higher than 200 million. So they probably walked away with 100 to 125 million dollars of pure profit and only reinvested half of what they took in actual construction costs. Oddly enough, residential construction can be somewhat more expensive, especially higher end residential is somewhat more expensive per square foot than prime office construction outside the New York or like downtown Chicago type of areas. So I think that they made a fabulous amount of money there. And I think that the combination of that plus what they were trying to do in the Tampa org. So let's talk about, so let's just really quickly go over the Buffalo thing. Right. So let's look at Buffalo, then let's look at Johannesburg, which isn't very complicated. And then let's look at Tampa, which was really a big step forward. And then you marry the dots that those 3 orgs connect with the dots that flag connect, and that leads you straight to the ideal org strategy.
Yep. Cool. So, okay. So Miscavige has this thing going down in Clearwater with the flag buildings, and Miscavige was, by the way, when Lisa McPherson, just to kind of segue into Buffalo, I want to set a little bit more scene for what was going on in the late 90s when this was all going down, because you had Miscavige personally at Flag dealing with the Lisa McPherson situation and the fallout from that and all the legal fallout from that, because it was the closest he's ever come to going to jail. Then you had all these renovations and stuff happening, and because Miscavige was personally in Clearwater, he was doing this big upgrade of the staff and the service lines and making sure Flag was this glittering model of service efficiency. And we were hearing about all this in West US out in LA, and we were getting sort of crumbs of this being thrown our way as to how the Big Blue facility should be upgrading ourselves and taking responsibility for ourselves and this sort of thing. So that was all going down. And then this thing happens in Buffalo. And Buffalo, as Miscavige himself explained it to us after the fact, the Buffalo building was going to be torn down, and eminent domain was being implemented by the local government to enforce that, because they had something that they were, some highway or railway or something they were going to build, and Buffalo had to move. They had no choice in the matter. And so what Miscavige said they did, and I don't have any other facts on this than what he said, was that they negotiated with the city or with the county or state or whoever it was who was implementing this, and ended up unloading their property, but getting like 2 times as much money back from them to purchase this new building that they were going to do. And so they decided, well, if we're going to do this, let's go all in. And they bought this very nice building, a historical building, if I understand it right. And they then proceeded to renovate it at some pretty big expense. And then they said, well, we can't just have a nice building with the 5 Buffalo staff who've been toddling along for all these years doing nothing. So we have to inject all of this life into Buffalo, which is where that bullet point list I mentioned earlier comes from, of Miscavige saying, okay, well, if we're going to do this, get the OTs on board, revitalize the staff, let's get this field going around this in a really big way, and let's make this a very special thing and really revitalize Buffalo as a Scientology activity.
And one of the most amusing points of this is you see the thread running through this, as you do through so much of Scientology management decision-making, is the assumption here is that the lack of sales of the product in Buffalo are due to the staff.
Yes.
That there's always
time.
an implicit assumption in Scientology, right?
Yes.
You read any of Hubbard's drivel, any of these policies, there's always an implicit assumption that demand for Scientology is infinite if only the staff weren't such fuck-ups.
Yes. He actually wrote a policy letter that says pretty much exactly what you just said. He doesn't say fuck-ups, but that is what he says. The demand for Scientology is infinite, and you should always assume that that is the case.
Yeah, and it's ludicrous. Any real business knows that, you know, you look at IBM. IBM years ago thought that demand for big-ass water-cooled mainframe computers was infinite, and it wasn't. Right. And, you know, that's a tiny sliver of IBM's business today, like 2% of IBM's business, and it was the most profitable business of the world in the 1960s and 1970s. And demand changes. And Scientology demand has certainly changed. Nobody wants a product that is as toxic as an armload, as I'm known to say, an armload of Ebola-coated kiddie porn.
Yes, I love that line.
And it's true. It's worth repeating because, you know, everybody has heard of Scientology through either Leia's show, a Google search, Larry Wright's book, and on and on and on and on and on. Anybody that's heard of Scientology or that looks it up on their phone knows one thing: run away. There are bigger cults out there in the U.S., and there are certainly bigger cults in the world, and there are many cults that actually have more money than Scientology, but there is none that has as toxic brand name.
That's right.
I digress.
No,
but anyway,
but you're on point there, because that is one of the reasons failure to address that underlies this entire thing. Like, this whole thing assumes that everybody is, well, and again, we've talked before, I've said, you know, Scientologists really truly believe everyone's a Scientologist, they just don't know it yet. And so there's this infinite demand.
That is a frequent arrogance of religions. Muslims and some Christians say the exact same thing in almost the exact same word, that humanity is inherently a believer in X, and they just got lost along the way. That's why we have to bring them back. That's right.
That's exactly right. And and also the other assumption, and this was not stated by Miscavige at any time, but I certainly said it when we were in Scientology, and I had every single Scientologist I ever said it to heartily agree with me, it's a field of dream strategy. If you build it, they will come.
Absolutely. No, that's absolutely true. Okay, so we saw the first glimmerings of that with Buffalo, right? Where they had
Yes.
a extra, they scored some money, they decided to spend up on a building, and the key thing, the key takeaway from that piece is that when they saw the nifty building, they then realized, oh shit, we've got to upgrade all of these morons, that are sitting behind desks and accomplishing nothing. So that organizational the physical upgrade also has to be accompanied by a massive organizational upgrade. And I don't know
That's
how
right.
many Sea Org they sent in to run Buffalo, but I'm sure it was quite laughable that
Well,
even
I
if you,
actually knew the stat. I knew the Sea Org members they sent in there, and they had to send a few teams in because they'd send team number one in, and they wouldn't succeed, and they bombed. And then they sent another team in, and then they bombed, and then they sent
well,
another team in.
you, yeah, and you think about it, right? And Buffalo in particular is susceptible to this, right? That you go and you get on staff in Buffalo and you discover that you hate life. What do? You escape. And of course, Buffalo is the gateway to the small, quaint rural Canada region of upstate New York that lies somewhere to the north. And so it's very easy for Sea Org members to get lost in the wilds of Canada, to, in the windswept prairies of Mississauga, that that they might even move to the village of Toronto, which is the capital of the Canada region, and still, but they can hide out in Canada in the trackless wastes. So Buffalo, I'm sure, was a tempting sort of jumping off point for a lot of people to blow Scientology.
Well, I know more than a couple Scientologists and Sea Org members who got sent to Buffalo and never came back. And this was,
Yeah.
and it's so funny in hindsight, of course. At the time, I didn't see this, but looking back on it, every single thing, every flaw of this strategy was actually pretty evident in Buffalo. From the fact of if you build it, they will come doesn't work. They open the doors with great fanfare. The mayor of Buffalo literally stood outside the doors and spoke about how wonderful Scientology is, and even used Scientology lingo in his speech. And yet the next day, it's a ghost town.
Mm-hmm.
And I know from my friends who were sent there, who then came back and told me all about the hellhole that it was like. That nobody was coming in. No one gave a shit about the fact that they opened up a new building downtown and now, whoa, look at Scientology. They're so impressive. No, nobody cared. And nobody walked in there and nobody was curious. They just went, oh, now it's a bigger building and there's great big windows and they could see inside and they could see nothing was going on and it didn't draw any new attention or anything. And so, of course, they rolled through various evolutions of staff, because it was always the staff members' fault. It wasn't Miscavige's fault. It wasn't the strategy's fault. And it wasn't the building's fault. So it had to be the staff.
Right. And that, of course, harkens back to our earlier comments about the data series, which is that in the data series, you can stack the deck so that it's never management's fault, it's never the product's fault, and it's never the organization's fault. It's always the poor schmendricks in the lower ranks that end up getting beat on.
That's right, which is the number one flaw with the data series, because it curtails critical thinking. It doesn't enhance it.
Yep. So then we move on to Johannesburg. And so as I understand what happened there is that somebody on staff got murdered in front of the building because it was in a crappy neighborhood. I think there's an awareness that, that it's not the case that, well, gosh, we don't feel good about ourselves because we don't have these posh headquarters. But no, all of a sudden there's an awareness that, we've let the real estate situation get sloppy, and it, that the real estate that, we're in the wrong part of town, and it's like,
yes.
Now that the word is out that somebody got murdered, we're going to have trouble keeping staff. Who's going to want to work here if they might be next? Now,
that's right.
Murder is, common in certain areas of Johannesburg, unfortunately, and statistically, you don't know that you're going to be next, but obviously it's going to keep customers away. So you get a situation.
Well, the Sea Org members couldn't even go outside at night. That was the rule.
Yeah.
In South Africa, I mean, you just don't.
And so you can't work 20-hour days because those people are going to work in the dark. They're coming home in the dark. So you can't work 20-hour days if they're not allowed out in the dark. So
exactly.
So obviously you got to fix that. So they did.
Yes, and they bought this property, which was out away from the main city, and obviously they did that on purpose. And I
Yep.
can't pretend to understand everything about South Africa and Johannesburg's geography and political situation, but yeah, I know that that safety was a concern.
Yeah, and you do have the situation where, today in South Africa, as it was 20 years ago when this happened, you do have a situation where essentially the rich whites are segregating themselves into, you know, access controlled neighborhoods and with heavy armed security presence. And so, yeah, there was clearly an incentive in South Africa that you had to join that. So
Yeah.
that set a precedent for locating the building out of the dangerous urban center. And I'm sure it all sort of was the vision of TGAC as the prison planet, the downtown Cincinnati or downtown Johannesburg or downtown Kansas City or whatever. You got to get out to the burbs and be safe. So
Right.
so anyway, so that was another point.
Which, by the way, is completely and 100% contrary to Hubbard's policies on where an org should be located.
Well, absolutely. Foot traffic is free,
Yep.
and foot traffic is worth paying for. Corner locations on an avenue in Manhattan, so like Fifth Avenue in Midtown, rents for, I haven't looked lately, but $500, $600, $700 per square foot per year to rent a prime store location on Manhattan, because the staggering amount of tourist foot traffic you get will blow your mind. And so, the Trader Joe's on Union Square in Manhattan, they're paying for a Trader Joe's, for a supermarket, they're paying $750 per square foot for a 10,000 foot box. So they're paying, what is that? If I'm doing it right, that's $8 million dollars a year in rent. But they're blowing 20 times the revenue per square foot of any grocery store in the country out of that location. It's worth it because of the foot traffic.
Right.
And
Right.
and so Hubbard was absolutely right in that foot traffic is the best free thing you can get, and you can have your body router standing out in front of the org, and even if there's a 0.01% success rate, you're going to nail a couple of bodies every day or two because there's just that much foot traffic. So, but I can
Yeah.
understand, the unique situation of Johannesburg, and the impact that it had on that organization. I can understand people, making sort of a defensive decision. Sometimes the defensive decisions you make are usually not your best ones. Making this defensive decision to get out of the Dodge, and seeing that eventually spreads mistakenly throughout the organization. But Hubbard was absolutely right about foot traffic, and he was absolutely right about cheap enough but not horrific buildings being an appropriate thing. But
Yes.
so here are two things that are taking the strategy in a very different direction, but the real capper is Tampa Bay.
Yes. Let's talk about that. So Tampa is the class 5 org, or the city level org, that is right next to Clearwater, right next to Flag. And Flag is the one and only class 12 org in the world, if you're going to put these in a hierarchy as to how the number of services they deliver. And a lot of people for many, many years wondered, why does Tampa even exist? Because there's Flag right there. And Flag had gotten this massive facelift in the late 90s, had gotten this, investor of millions of dollars and COB's personal attention for years to upgrade the service lines and make them speedy and fast. You have Sea Org members dedicated 24/7 to, they upgraded the hotels. They had concierge service now. They had the equivalent of 4 or 5-star restaurants installed at the Fort Harrison. I mean, this tremendous thing happened at Flag, while Tampa is sitting there in this shit-ass little building with a few staff, and its real only purpose was to deal with Flag's rejects, the people that Flag couldn't service.
Right. And so you have imagine, think of the level of screw up that represents. You have a national customer base for the Tampa org, that somebody comes to Flag and their wife, for whatever reason, is not Flag certified or whatever the term is, and they have to go do auditing with some class 4 auditor in Tampa while, hubby is getting the treatment.
That's
And
right.
the dichotomy of having to go to a crap organization in some strip mall in Tampa and be audited at some cheap, wobbly folding table purchased at the local Staples, while hubby is in the quote mecca of technical perfection with all sorts of smooth indirect lighting, air conditioning that works, and all sorts of other wonderful benefits. And you're going to, gobble down, stale croissant sandwiches at the local Jack in the Box while he's eating at the whatever in the Fort Harrison. The dichotomy is unacceptable, right? So if
That's
you're
right.
going to have Flag be a destination resort, even the cast-offs have to get catered to so you can take their money. So, so
Exactly.
they, so they, so the brilliant innovation here was exactly what we talked about a few minutes ago, which is making the OT field responsible for this because it was hopeless. If the staff in Tampa couldn't get it done with a national customer base, the only one in the system, then it says something pretty awful about Scientology. So you have to give the customers the skin in the game. And that's where the idea that the customers were going to raise the money, and that it was going to be a historic building, kind of like what they did with Buffalo, and they were going to doll it up so that the OTs would have skin in the game to disseminate, right?
That's
Because
right.
one of the things about Scientology is people are embarrassed at this point, and certainly even in 2003 when this was getting started, people were embarrassed to own up to being a Scientologist. I've
Yes.
talked to many an ex-member who not only didn't raise their kids as Scientologists, but never told coworkers. They never tried to bring people in. And so if you push the responsibility onto the OT, and by the way, remember, competitors to Scientology, such as EST, now Landmark Education, were very good at getting people to sign up their friends, right? That was a big part of doing all of the courses, is there was always an undercurrent of you got to bring your friends. And they would put the heat up, not severe reality adjustment a la Miscavige level, but there was a constant undertone of heat to get people to bring their friends and the members to be a sales force. And it
Yes.
worked. If you look at how many people go through Landmark every year, it's not that much money because they don't do donations. It's all strictly like a corporate training program, but they get like 100,000 people a year going through some version of their courses. That's not bad.
That's right. And to
And
think that
and it
Miscavige isn't paying attention to that or doesn't look into that sort of thing would be foolish. He spends
no,
a
of
lot
course
he spends time looking at what are other groups doing that's successful that we should be doing. It's such a I mean and this is back then. I'm not talking about now. I think he's given up on it at this point, but he was spending some time in the 90s and early 2000s trying to figure out what are we not doing that we should be doing
yeah.
that would, you know,
Yeah, and so strategically, this is a good idea. The problem is, as Miscavige does it, right, there's a small number of OTs trying to raise however much they spent on Tampa. At one point, I would recall what that was, but I've forgotten it now. But, you figure 6, 8, 10, $12 million out of a OT committee of 30 to 50 people raising money from even from the Clearwater field, it took a while. But basically, by the time the third one of these orgs in the series, Tampa is along, the basics of the ideal org program are set. But I
yep,
think that he finally, when that last piece fell into place, Miscavige did a nice piece of what we call bottom-up strategy. And bottom-up strategy is a really important thing in business because if you get too fixated on your brilliant one strategic idea that you then go and then you break down into little chunks and then you implement each of the chunks as part of this grand strategy, a top-down strategy can often be a great thing. But if you look at Google, Google did not have a top-down strategy for world domination of search, cartography, email, browser technology, and mobile devices. They hadn't thought of any of that except for the search part. But they hadn't even really figured out how to make money with search. All of their strategy came bottom up. So Gmail came, they invented, so some guy came up with a really cool programming hack in a browser to make browser applications look cool. And then they said, well, what can we build with it? And the guy said, I don't know, maybe we should build just a simple email program to challenge Hotmail. And they go, okay, do that. And then they figured out what they could use that for. as an element of the world domination strategy. So they didn't start by selling investors. I didn't invest in Google. I was not on the West Coast, and it was a very, very narrow deal. So there was so many people trying to get into Google. But I know world domination was not the pitch. It was, we can invent this search thing and we can sell ads and it'll be great because of this. And it was a great deal on the basis of search. But Google fell into the rest of the world domination scheme. And so bottom up strategy can often work really well. My favorite example is Taco Bell. So Taco Bell had a problem competing with Happy Meals, where you get a Coke. Happy Meal was a great deal for McDonald's. You convince parents to buy a Coke and a fries, which are very profitable items, on top of a burger, because you sell it at the same price and you throw in a free toy. Unfortunately, Taco Bell could never come up with a toy that anybody wanted. So they finally just decided to suck it up and put out 12 packs at a discount. And the idea was that a family with 3 kids would come in. They would buy a 12 pack of tacos. They would buy a couple of premium items for mom and dad. They'd buy 2 large drinks and 3 Cokes. And they would do that between 5:30 and 7, and it would get kids in the store. Just suck it up, give a discount, don't try to compete on McDonald's turf. So they did that. Then they discovered that that buyer that they targeted was only a small part of the sales. Most of the sales were people after 11:30 at night buying 3 of these boxes, 11 premium items, 6 large drinks.
Now,
what they
who could it be who would be coming in at 11 o'clock at night for tacos? I wonder.
It took them a while to actually figure out what somebody suspected. And you're exactly right. It's stoners.
Yes.
And what they figured out was that the stoner market segment was actually a viable and identifiable customer base. And they then said, we're going to strategically target the stoner market because there is such a thing and nobody had seen that before. So they went out and they put out, and this was about 10 years ago, they put out an advertising campaign called Fourth Meal, which was just slightly twigged towards, if you knew what it was about, you knew what was going on. They were not very.
When I moved here to Colorado, I had not been part of this market or demographic at all. And once I became part of it, I started seeing the marketing for it all over Denver, you know, and Taco Bell absolutely is all over that here.
And the payoff for Taco Bell of this bottom-up strategy of stumbling on a customer and then turning it into a strategy of they grew business about 8% in a year or two. In the fast food market, that is a staggering home run.
Yep.
And it worked out really well for them. And a couple of the other less popular, you didn't see McDonald's and Burger King do this. And burgers are not that popular with stoners, but you saw Jack in the Box actually get Cheech and Chong to do a YouTube commercial. So they really went there. But the point is that a bottom-up strategy can be very successful. And that's what the ideal org strategy fundamentally is. These 3 orgs came along, and you had at the same time the enormous financial success of all the excess donations from Flag coming in. And all of a sudden, these come together, the light goes on, and you say, aha, our strategy to go out, bind our customers to us by getting all these OT committees and all these OTs that are committed, they have some skin in the game to driving expansion because our staff is a bunch of fuck-ups. Yep. And we have this fundraising opportunity, and we keep Tom Cruise happy because he reputedly said, I don't want to bring my friends to these loser buildings that you have, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It looks like a magic, it looks like a magic box. So
that's exactly right. And I'm really glad you brought this bottom-up strategy thing up because I, for example, had not thought about it, and I know most exes hadn't, that such a thing could evolve rather than originate from the top and be pushed down, because that's how we think of Scientology, is it's all a brainchild of Hubbard or a brainchild of Miscavige. But this strategy really was a bit of a Google thing. It really was an accident of circumstance and opportunity and potential that was all sort of, built up by Miscavige in putting this whole thing together.
Yeah, and so you basically, to his credit, he understood that he backed into the strategy, but he understood what it could have meant to him. So then all of a sudden, Now that the flag thing is on its way,
Yep.
now this is an opportunity because you have one flag building and one flag only. You can't have like Disneyland Hong Kong. You can't have multiple, you can only have one flag building that's the
Right.
Mecca.
That's
So
right.
you can't have like continental meccas. You have to have one flag building to get people from all over the world. So here's an opportunity to replicate it in miniature. Sounds good. Turns out it's the second best strategy compared to flag. Here's how we look at it. So I think the ideal org strategy has gone in two phases. The first phase is done, and that's not a good thing that it's done. But the first phase just looked like mini flags. They go out and they get these historic buildings, whether you're talking Tel Aviv, whether you're talking the one that they tried to get in Boston that they're screwing up and that they're now selling in favor of the crappy one which is not the phase one. This is Ideal Org 2.0. But they got all these historic properties. They raised money successfully, and they were able to do the renovations. And it all looked pretty good because you have two fundraisers, right? Get the initial building,
Yep.
and then you make people feel guilty. You have a sunk cost bias to dig deeper and then give money on a shitload of renovations.
Yep.
And of course, you're siphoning off all of the excess donations. So you
Yep.
raise 10 million for a $4 million building. You raise 10 million for 5 million in renovations. You walk off you spend 10 million, which gets the IRS somewhat happy. And you then have this extra profit and you just keep doing this. The problem is that over time, when you have an organization that's not growing, you get donor fatigue setting in. A smaller
Right.
number of bodies covering an expanding program.
That's right. And we were seeing that in comments and lack of money coming in. By the end of 2010, we were already seeing that fatigue setting in.
And so you certainly saw fatigue in certain communities that were pretty pathetic, right? So
Yes.
you saw this in was it St. Louis or Kansas City, Albuquerque, Battle
Yep.
Creek. Battle Creek, why the hell is there an org in Battle Creek? The metro area has a population of like 150,000. How many
Yes.
Scientologists are there in Battle Creek? 8? 10? So you have these, stillborn attempts and, in places like Dublin, New Haven, et cetera. Toronto, the small village that's the capital of Canada. You have all of these other sorts of, tiny little places where nothing happens, but you have some mainstream successes, right? But then it starts to hit the wall. And the proof point for this thing running out of gas is the Valley Org. It took them 10 years to buy the building in the largest concentration of Scientologists in the world. And that's with
right.
Nancy Cartwright kicking in matching funds in a couple of campaigns. I don't know how much she gave as a percentage of the total, but
she at least 5 million, if not 10. She gave a ton of money.
Yeah, I'm sure she gave a couple $1,000,000. I don't know whether it was half, whether she was matching for all of it, but there were matching campaigns where she signed up to match whatever came in. And these are all sort of prime rank and file demographics. All the dentists and chiropractors that are, sort of mid to upper level whale donors are in the Valley, and they couldn't get it done in 10 years.
Right.
And then it isn't clear how much of the money for renovations they actually raised. It wouldn't surprise me, and I'm speaking as an educated guess here, not based on actual numbers. It wouldn't surprise me if Miscavige ended up having to pony up most of the money for renovations because it was so stalled. It was becoming an immense embarrassment. Now, we'd already seen them in a couple of other orgs. In particular, we know we've got documentation from the New Zealand government on Auckland. The Church International, and I don't recall exactly which entity, but International Management loaned the Auckland org 10 million New Zealand dollars to buy the building. And that's actually a tax issue for them because I don't think they're tax exempt, but there's a note from the government that says you got to show that you can pay this back. And of course, their revenue is not enough to cover the debt service, much less the operating expenses. I think there's about 150 Scientologists in New Zealand, maybe 200 tops, and not enough to support a $10 million building. So we've already seen this thing flame out in a few places, and it really hit the skids with the Valley. So that leads us to the Ideal Org 2.0 strategy, which we're seeing in Orlando and which we now just saw in the last week or so when they announced they were buying this building in Albuquerque. They're buying stuff on the cheap. The Orlando building costs $35 a square foot. That's a fraction of the cost of replacement construction. And it's in an industrial park, zero drive-by traffic, all destination traffic. In other words, the only time people going down that street is they're going to a specific business.
Right.
No foot traffic, none. And it's a crappy neighborhood in Orlando, away from the parks, away from the school, away from anything else.
Wow.
So you have a building that, and there's no attempt at fundraising for this. And you would think that the Tampa Clearwater org crowd, they would be able to find a way to get Travolta or the Feshbacks, the ones that aren't bankrupt anyway, or somebody to kick in to find $1.5 million to buy this crappy building. They couldn't do it. So they quietly soft pedaled the fact that there was no fundraising campaign. And you'll notice it's now all about, hey, we'll keep doing this, right? So now Miscavige, so this is telling us something important. The fact that they're doing these ideal orgs and that they're doing them on the cheap, right? The per foot cost in Albuquerque is $40 a foot, right in line with what was in Orlando. And they're probably going to be doing the renovations on the cheap. The fact is that this is clearly an indicator that this is all about maintaining Miscavige's legitimacy to lead the organization.
Right.
And
that's right, because he cannot be seen to fail on this. And we'll, in future podcasts that we have planned right now, we're going to talk about some other epic fails of his, because he's not this brilliant mastermind. He is definitely using some opportunities and potentials to his advantage with this.
Yeah, you're right. But we do have to be intellectually honest. We have to say when Miscavige does make a correct decision.
Yes.
And, some of these decisions we talked about are correct. They're not brilliant, but they're competent. Mm-hmm. Other areas are not so competent. And, and in some cases it's because of his own ineptitude, and in some cases because he's got to play a crappy hand. So right now, he's got to play a crappy hand because he's got to maintain his own legitimacy. He's got to be seen to be answering the issue of Debbie Cook's email and pressure that's already been coming from members prior to that, which is, how come we can't recruit new bodies? So he's got to have a why. The why is, we have shitty buildings, and so if you fix them, they will come. Now, as this plays out, he'll find some other thing that will be the new why that nobody comes in.
Yes.
And so this will continue to fade. But for right now, he's committed to making all of the orgs ideal. So he's now flipped over and he's starting to do this on the cheap. And he's starting to do this regardless of whether the individual ideal org projects are profit-making opportunities to win donations. So he's hoping that other things will come along. So he's essentially buying time here.
Right.
And he is buying off the IRS. It's easy to figure out. The IRS knows exactly how much money Scientology has. In the wake of 9/11, this legislation was passed called the Patriot Act. And with the Patriot Act and 15 years of really slow but determined diplomacy, bank secrecy in the world has been sharply reduced. So the thing is that even if the U.S. government were to go after Scientology, it would be unable to seize Scientology's assets, but it already knows exactly where they are.
Right. So so you're saying that the days of the secret Swiss bank accounts and being able to siphon money off and store it somewhere where nobody knows where it is and can't access the records on it, those days are pretty much over at this point?
Yeah, greatly reduced, if not completely dead. So the thing is that if the IRS were to go after Miscavige and talk about excess accumulation of capital as a means of taking away the tax exemption, which is the foundation of his legitimacy, right? I won the war against the IRS.
Yes.
If the thing is, he wouldn't be able to come up with phony bank statements and say, well, we only have the 36 million in the Caymans. The IRS would be able to say, yeah, well, there's also this account, this account, this account, this account, this account. And as of yesterday, those accounts contained 1.6 billion.
Right.
So in other words, it's very easy these days for the IRS to prove him a liar if he understates his assets. So he has to actually spend the money. So that's what the strategy is going to continue to is going to continue to drive. It's all about his legitimacy, and he's going to try to stay ahead of the IRS. And
Which is
again,
one reason why the Scientology media productions happened, if not the reason. I mean,
well, I think
that's
again
not an ideal org thing, but it was a huge investure of money in the KTLA studios in the middle of Los Angeles that were completely unnecessary because they're just doing double duty for what they had already invested and created out in San Jacinto.
yeah, and I think I think one of the things there's a whole series we can do on that. I think there were a whole bunch of reasons that led to the creation of SMP, but I think again it was to essentially try to distract from the problem with the last surefire recruiting strategy of the ideal orgs. Right now we've got 34 or however many ideal orgs done. Nobody knew was coming in, and now that the whales are starting to get restless again and saying, well, it's still not happening. And so then you say, okay, we'll have a centralized media facility that will now go ahead and broadcast. Now, of course, we know what happened, which is exactly what's happening. A month or two of joke fodder for every late night talk show host in the world, followed by complete oblivion.
That's right.
And we knew that was going to happen, and that's exactly how it's gone. But they circulated the story about how, one of the most ludicrous statements ever is like 15 minutes after they started broadcasting at 8 o'clock at night Eastern on whatever day this was, the local org somewhere was so full that the fire marshal came swooping in and said, you have to turn people away. So, which is just ludicrous beyond belief. The idea that somebody is going to sit there and say, I'm not doing anything. After watching this for 3 minutes, I'm going to leap in the car and drive to the Scientology org in Tampa and clamor to sign up for classes.
Right.
That's exactly how it works.
Yeah, that sounds plausible.
But
sure.
but again, it's the stories that they can make up. They now have a story of, it's like, this is Charlie Brown in the football, right? Every year Lucy says, I'm not going to take the ball away, and every year Charlie Brown goes, you lied the last however many years. And she goes, no, I really mean it this time. And then, of course, she still manages to jerk the ball away, and Charlie Brown ends up flat on his back again. And so, it's a very Charlie Brown / Wile E. Coyote, these doomed schemes at work.
Yep.
But basically, I think to sort of start to move towards winding this up is, the ideal org strategy is harder inherently to, right, over time. And this is why growth slows in companies. There's a saying on Wall Street, trees don't grow to the sky. Eventually, gravity catches up to you. Eventually, the complexity of growing a business 10% a year becomes too hard, and you just can't do it anymore. And so, basically the ideal org game only works when the underlying business is in growth mode. If you take the ideal org game to be a fundraising campaign, it only works when the organization is in growth mode. And Scientology is a long ways from being in growth mode. It's like the coal business. It's in managed decline to be charitable. Right. And so this is why we've seen the strategy adjusted and flipped over to buildings on the cheap, screw the fundraising. We just have to keep doing these things to keep Miscavige on the throne. And so, the thing is that the other problem is that the carrot of the ideal org doesn't work forever. Flag, you can build flag, and then you can gin it up Potemkin Village style, so that flag is always busy by cannibalizing services from the outer org, and saying now, the Dallas org can't deliver blah, blah, blah service. You have to come to flag. So you can keep pulling more and more business away from the outer orgs. But when you try to build the outer org business with a product that no new customers want, and you've restricted the old customers from buying certain products at the org, the impedance mismatch between all of the expense on these orgs, all of the promise about how this is going to be about dissemination and bringing people in, and if you build it, they will come, and the reality of people are only coming to the orgs for a smaller and smaller range of services, and they walk in and it's deader than ever before, it doesn't work after a while. The promise
Exactly.
that the ultimate hook, that the OT 9 and 10 levels would be released when everybody goes ideal and their new St. Hill size. Now all of a sudden, people are starting to go, this is not looking like we're making forward progress here.
That's right.
And that's
That's
the
right.
big hook. Your spiritual progress is dependent on you making this strategy work. And people are starting to realize it's the fourth quarter. We're down 49-3. They've got the ball on our 5-yard line and it's 2 minutes left. People, I think, intuitively know, even if they're good at thought stopping and denying it. And I think that, the disaffection that happens when people realize the ideal org strategy isn't working at their local org or at any other orgs they visit is going to be a problem. I think that,
Oh, I think that what you're talking about is well on its way, because I was noticing and noting on my channel 3 years ago that it was very apparent to me that the concentration of effort in terms of money and service was in the Sea Org level organizations. That other than getting these buildings going and happening, very, very little attention is paid to these outer class 5 orgs, these city level orgs.
Yeah.
They don't get management attention. They don't get management care. The staff are left to flounder around for the most part. And that's not good business, but it's Miscavige looking at, well, where do we get the most bang for our buck on an immediate basis, which of course also goes back to the whole, neurotic week to week stat thing. And also where, we've only got so many resources. There's only so many human assets in the world of Scientology to utilize. So where do you concentrate their attention? And they've been concentrating it at the Sea Org level facilities.
It's at the Sea Org level, and it's at the flag
Yes.
level and a flag customer level.
That's
and
right.
I think
And they've been actively pulling those flag public out of the class 5 or city level orgs and encouraging them, go to flag, which is, wholly counterintuitive to building these city level orgs, but that's what they're doing. It's just observable.
Yeah, and it's going to work out that eventually flag is going to be like the ship. I've talked to several people who made OT7 and they said, we're not going to go to OT8 because we'd have to go to the ship and they're not going to let us off the ship because they know how much money we have. They're not going to let us off until they get a major pound of flesh out of us. And we're done at that point. I think that's going to increasingly happen with all of these, you've got to come to flag for everything. And, oh gosh, you schedule a week and then we discover that there's some screw up on auditing and you've got to be reprocessed or whatever it is. And, oh gosh, it turned into 4 weeks at primo hotel rates. And sorry, we didn't know.
Yep. That's right, because
the
out of towners become captive audiences. On the ship, you literally have no choice. They've literally taken your damn passport, but they'll do that same, like you just said, they'll do the same thing at flag, and that's going to bomb on them.
Continue. Exactly. And so, but I think one of the things, I'm not sure whether this is the point to talk about it or whether it's another whole discussion, which is to say, in some ways, the ideal org strategy as it's implemented is absolutely about not recruiting any more people to Scientology, putting these things way out of town, having automated recruitment, which flies in the face of the typical model that's been successful for cult recruitment, and all of the rest of it.
Yeah.
All of that.
Well, all you're doing right now is reinforcing what I've been saying. The Miscavige that's just not what he's interested in.
No, what he's interested in is maximizing his control and power over his few remaining members, and he wants to get every dollar that he can. The situation is fundamentally that there are still enough whales that are donating. He doesn't, Jeff Augustine penned a thing years ago called Monastery Scientology, and I think it's coming true. And it was basically the idea, and he wrote this in 2008 and said, they are going to retreat. So they're already largely retreated from St. Hill. There's a lot of stuff now that used to go at St. Hill that you have to come to flag for. There's a lot of stuff, there's just not much going on at St. Hill. So they're already retreating from there. And they've got LA and they've got Clearwater. And that's what Jeff predicted was You're going to have LA and Clearwater, and you're going to have a small number of wealthy members, and he's going to fleece them for every dime they have. And as long as he has, I think it's more important for him to have the staff to abuse. I think that gives him a lot more emotional satisfaction than
Yes.
the members. So
Yes.
as long as he has a viable operation in LA and Clearwater, he doesn't fundamentally care how many staff are in the mission in Guadalajara.
That's right.
And
All of that is only something he gives lip service to at events, and something that is a rationalization or a justification for him to be able to further abuse the staff that are directly in his line of sight.
exactly. And so that is the sense of, that's the emotional payload for him.
Yep.
That the emotional payload. I think while he sees extracting money from members as an expression of power over the members, not
Yes.
necessarily from money for its own sake. Yeah, there's the skin diving vacations, there's the custom shoes, there's a few things that he spends money on, but not like Hubbard. Hubbard was
Right.
all about the money, and yes, very much about the personal power. But Miscavige is about inflicting wreckage on the staff and and controlling the membership,
Yep.
from a sense of personal contempt and arrogance. And it's not, the money is another vector of control. It's
I
not
agree
about
completely.
what the numbers are. And so as
Yep.
long as he continues to have this organization that feeds his needs for power over the staff in these two locations and control, he'll let the rest of it wither. And
Yep.
just as Hubbard did, Hubbard had no succession plan in place. He was in failing health for years and yet never made a move to actually succeed. That's the narcissism of cult leadership, that Miscavige will go the same way. He will not have any succession plan in place. He won't care what happens to the organization after he dies. They'll carry him out in a box, and who knows what will happen. It's the case. It might be another battle where the guy that wins the succession fight comes out of an unexpected quarter, right? Nobody saw Miscavige coming except Miscavige. Pat and Annie Broker got steamrolled, and they never even knew what hit them.
That's right.
And none of the other guys that expected it at all. And so a similar thing could happen. Or I think, by the way, we're kind of diverting here, but it might be fun to wrap up with this, to say, okay, it looks like, so I've been spending a lot of time on this NXIVM cult lately. This bunch up in upstate New York, the guy that got arrested. See my blog or our blog for the stories I've done about NXIVM. And there are some interesting parallels to Scientology. He does use some terminology from Dianetics, but I don't think he was ever, quote, in Scientology. But basically, that organization's imploding because I don't think it had a critical mass of staff and organizational structure to keep members in the face of the founder's arrest on criminal charges. I think that Scientology has enough organizational mass that even without a groomed successor to Miscavige, it will persist in some form. Yeah. It will be like North Korea, right? You had, Kim Il-sung, the mighty leader who was pretty good. Then you had his odd-looking and inept son, and then now you have his clownish fool of a grandson running the place. So the quality of leadership in North Korea has gone down a bit over the last 70 years, but they're still bumbling and fumbling along.
That's right.
And the same thing.
I've sort of predicted, if I had to put my money on anything, I would put it on a JW model, where maybe a council of people take over rather than one guy steps up. And I could be totally wrong about that, but I just see that the parallels between the development of the Jehovah's Witnesses and Scientology are so interesting, and that would be the next logical step in that progression, is that maybe a bunch of withered old guys take over, and it becomes, as my friend Lloyd Evans, ex-JW activist, has said, it becomes the survival of the dumbest in keeping the thing going.
I think Scientology's culture is antithetical to that. I think the JW culture, it turns out that the governing body at the Jehovah's Witnesses was very low key until about 30 years ago. And then they turned into what they are today, which is, claiming, direct divine inspiration, which they never really claimed before, and taking on more and more direct oversight of the organization and more direct attempts to control the behavior of individuals in the church with, preaching to them more than ever before. But I really don't think Scientology is set up for a group command structure. Culturally, I just don't think it's going to work.
And I mean, on paper they are, so we'll see.
Yeah,
but we'll see how it goes.
But the whole paper structure that Larry/Denise Brennan put together 30 years ago was immediately ignored. Anyway.
But we can't ignore, and we don't have to get into a big debate about this right this second, but we can't ignore the influence of Miscavige on that.
Yeah, he shredded what was left.
It looks like it worked. It kind of worked for a little while, but he kept cutting it off at the knees because of his dictatorial nature.
Yeah, and the thing is that anybody that's in Scientology that's in a position to grab power has grown up in that culture, and that's how they're going to react to it. So, but
sure.
the thing is the org. So to back up to how that relates to the ideal orgs, so the ideal orgs are doomed. Scientology is not in expansion mode. The ideal org strategy is going to run its course, and every hand that they have to play from here out is worse than the ideal org strategy.
Yes,
and
that's right.
It will just continue to fade, and
it's
eventually
keep consuming itself.
It will keep consuming itself. It's already, as I've said before, the ideal org strategy really proves this, that Scientology's already passed the event horizon. They're not able to flip over somehow and get back into growth mode. They're already past the point of no return. They're still able to harm the individuals and the families of those still in. But as far as being able to grow and be a larger danger to the culture as a whole, not so much. There are other groups out there that are effectively harnessing social media, right? And so here you have Scientology building, the ideal org strategy was what they did instead of social media. It's what they did instead of delivering service over the internet.
Right.
Now you have all of these new age, young, social media hip cult entrepreneurs like Teal Swan, Bettino Massaro, and a few others that are all about Facebook and YouTube to recruit. They deliver videos that you subscribe to, and if you dig those, then they bring you in for events, and that's when they've got you hooked. But it's a very, very much more, it's a low-cost marketing model to get people hooked in. It won't be as big as Scientology. It's not as complex organizationally, but it's sure profitable piece of business. It'll only get so high. It won't get to the size of Scientology, but it'll move on. And that's the way that new cults are going to go. Old groups like TM, the Moonies, Scientology, and others are stuck in the past. Ideal org is stuck in the past. Big fancy buildings are not what millennials are going to go for. Scientology media productions and Scientology TV are coming along trying to harness social media, and they're doing it too late and too ineptly and too badly to be effective. So so the ideal org is really a watershed in proving that Scientology's past the point of no return. Scientology TV will not undo that.
Exactly. Well, John, thank you very much for your insights on all of this, and I think it's great, and I think your summation there was wonderful and spot on. People have grown very cynical in the ex-Scientology community about people preaching the end of Scientology, and we're not saying that this is all going to happen in the next year. I don't think that's what you're saying. I mean, they've got assets, they've got buildings, they've got people. This is going to keep going for a while. Well, but I think you're absolutely right in terms of if you were to graph this trajectory, that is exactly what's going on as we are looking at this. And the way I've simplified it is, Scientology's dead and they just don't know it yet. And that's basically what in effect you're saying.
There's two examples to show what happens. I agree with you completely. Scientology does not implode and disappear and shutter the doors.
Right.
The decline of Scientology is going to be very different. Well, three examples. First, Christian Science. Christian Science Church, they have closed half the churches in the U.S. Membership is down by 60% in the last 40 or 50 years. The number of Christian Science practitioners that do that the healing stuff is down by 80%. membership is down more than half.
Wow.
And they are closed, they are shedding facilities, but they're continuing for a very long time.
Yeah.
In business, there's an example of kind of walking dead. So 75 or 80 years ago, U.S. Steel was the most powerful company in the American economy. They were the largest supplier of the most critical material needed to run the economy. So even before World War II, where it was a national asset, it was still, if you wanted to make something, you had to deal with U.S. Steel, and they could decide how much of their production they were going to allocate to you. It was a staggeringly important part of the economy. They had unchecked power. Today, U.S. Steel still exists, but who cares? It's still making steel, but nobody cares. They are not a force in the industry. It's all the Indians and the Japanese and the Koreans making steel that count.
Mm.
The third example is in terms of cults. And this is one that Dr. Stephen Kent, who's that noted scholar in religion, turned me on to in an email a while ago. There was a group in England called the Muggletonians. And it was named after a guy named Muggleton. It has nothing to do with Harry Potter.
Harry Potter? Okay.
Right. But the Muggletonians were founded in the 1650s or thereabouts. And I forget what their theory, was a Christian, sort of weird Christian offshoot. And the Muggletonians were basically laughed out of town within about 20 or 25 years. So by 1675 or thereabouts, they were done. On the other hand, the last Muggletonian died in 1975.
Right.
300 years after the Muggletonians' brief moment of relevance.
Right.
So
trying to kill an idea. I mean, ideas are bulletproof. They just go and go and go. And there are millions of printed books of L. Ron Hubbard's works, and his lectures on the CDs. They're in libraries. They're around. I mean, the idea of killing Scientology utterly is a fantasy.
Well, it will live. It will continue to drift downwards and be irrelevant unless some unforeseeable quantum event happens that causes it to blow up. And I argue that event is of necessity unforeseeable.
Yeah.
We could have said it was a pretty good bet in 1977 that most of the senior management went to jail for Operation Snow White. It would have been a very reasonable bet to say, these guys are toast, they'll be out of business in 3 years. And yet their membership didn't peak until 15 years later. So, we do want to be careful about predicting the end of Scientology, but I think the ideal org strategy is a really nice barometer that says these guys are past the event horizon. Absolutely still dangerous and capable of inflicting tremendous damage on the people around it, but not on the society as a whole. Doesn't mean we shouldn't keep doing the work we're doing. It just means that we need to have confidence that, that there's nothing they can do to get out of the box that they're in.
Yeah, exactly. Because our role as critics and commentators is important. I mean, what we do is very contributive to, what set the stage for the documentaries and for Leah's show and for these various things that really have put the sort of the stake in the heart of the thing. But it's you got to keep going. You got to finish the job. So, all right. So we have gone way over here, but John, I really, again, appreciate your time and attention on this. I think you've given some very, very good insight into what this whole ideal org thing is about and how it was about as unideal as you can imagine. And so thank you. And we have some future episodes we'll be doing that we've already planned out. So look for those, folks. Any questions, comments, feedback, good, bad, or sideways, go ahead and leave them in the comments section here on YouTube or at sensiblyspeaking.com. As I mentioned earlier, I will post a link here to the Reasoned Life blog, which is what John P. writes for. And that's our show for this week. So bye-bye, folks.
See you guys.